Pessoal, bom dia. Hoje nós estamos aqui com o professor Edlund Anderson, que é da Universidade de La Sabana e de outras universidades também, e que vai nos explicar hoje um pouco sobre a trajetória e a carreira acadêmica dele, e também um pouco do trabalho dele que ele realiza dentro da Era Viking. Professor, thank you so much for stay here with us and explain a little about your work. And so, how do you start your career in about the Viking research?
My parents like to blame my aunt, my father's sister, who gave me a book about Norse mythology for Christmas. I got a book about Norse mythology for Christmas from my aunt when I was about 12, and everything probably comes from that. After that, I was hooked. So, yeah, I started when I was a kid, just interested in Norse mythology. You can tell from my name, my family has Scandinavian heritage, although I was born in the United States. My parents were born in the United States. My grandparents were born in the United States, but they always were interested, part of the identity. So it started from that, but then it just became, more and more a thing that I was interested in and wanted to do, and that I felt good at. So when I went to university, I thought about doing science, but it turned out I was really bad at mathematics, but really good at Swedish and Old Norse. So I studied those things. And then also I've worked in information technology. I've worked in companies for high technology companies, but when I went to graduate school, it was Old Norse and Scandinavian studies and Viking studies. So yeah. And here I am.
That's great. It's amazing.
You need a lot of passion to sustain you in this field, I think. So
yes, I understand it. It's a thing that sometimes family or we discover and they present to us and we like to study about it.
But I also think, we have one life, so you might as well do something that you enjoy in that life. So.
Yes. And what is the principal topics of your research in the Viking?
That's a good question, because it's probably changed over time. When I was, my undergraduate degree was in folklore and mythology, and my thesis was about the Rook runestone in Sweden, which has a lot of legendary and mythological associations with it. And then for my graduate research, it was really about the changing culture in Scandinavia between the Roman period at the beginning of the AD period, all the way up through the Viking Age and into the medieval period, and about the kind of integration of Scandinavia into the larger European culture, and how people express their identity both as separate from the wider European culture, but also as part of that culture. So that change that you get as you go through the Iron Age and through the Viking Age and the conversion to Christianity, and then part of the larger European sphere. So it was very cultural, that research, and I think that led me, and also my life, because I've moved around and lived in the United States, in Europe, in South America. I also became very interested in the intercultural aspects of Scandinavian culture. Traditionally, I think, especially in the 19th century, scholars and the general public looked at Scandinavian culture as some sort of hermetically sealed bubble that was like archaic and pagan and away from the rest of the world. And really, there's always been a lot of interaction. So I think what I have increasingly looked at is the interaction between Scandinavian culture and other cultures in Europe, especially, and looking at the exchange of stories and language, and the interactions, the interculturality, the connections, and that may be because that's also been my experience. It's been part of my life, so it's been important to me. So I'm very interested in what happened to other people 1,000 years ago when they were in contact with other cultures and how they responded and absorbed and learned. And I think that's probably what I'm looking at mostly.
Oh, that's nice. I think it's a very good work. I saw your work about the rookstone, and it's
Okay.
very interesting. When I saw in Academia Pontedo, I think it's very, very, very interesting. And the work that you have about this process in the Old English and the Old Norse, it's very, very interesting perspective, I think. And what's your results you have while studying the rookstones? What's your...
Well, the rookstone was a long time ago, and I've thought about, I have a few colleagues that we've thought about doing it again, looking at some of those materials, but I'm not sure I really have very much to say about the rookstone at the moment that hasn't been said better by other people in the last 20 years. There's still research, there's been recent research by a group of Swedish runologists and archaeologists who have an interpretation. One of my former professors, Joseph Harris, has published a lot on the rookstone, and they don't all agree with each other, but I'm not sure I have anything to add to it. Although there are aspects on the rookstone that look to me very intercultural. There's some materials on it that look like they're connected to West Germanic or Frisian contexts and other things that, of course, are Scandinavian. But I haven't really thought of anything coherent to say about that. Most recently, I've been thinking about the Skjöldung, heroic legends that you have and that you appear in Beowulf in the Old English context, and also in medieval Scandinavian context. And I've been trying for some years to think of some coherent things to say about those. And I think I have some, but I haven't really published more than about one paper on that yet. So.
Yeah, I saw that you have a work about Beowulf, and how we can say more about Beowulf, and what is interesting to say how Beowulf contributes to the studies about the Scandinavian, how the importance of this poem.
That's still an excellent question after several centuries of people arguing about Beowulf. I think certainly in Old English, almost nothing has been published about more than Beowulf. Yet still there seems to be more to say. It's a topic that everyone argues about and nobody can agree about, which is probably a good thing because it means we still have things to talk about. Of course, Beowulf is, renowned as one of the most important Old English poems, but of course, as has long been recognized, its content is Scandinavian. Its setting is Scandinavian, its characters are Scandinavian. And so there's always been this tension between looking at it as a Old English object, which of course it is. It's produced in Old English language, it's produced in England, but also looking at it as a Scandinavian object because it's all about Scandinavia. It's a Old English story about Scandinavia. And that's, of course, what makes it interesting to me. I'm interested in it as this combination of cultures, this cross-fertilization. And I'm interested in those stories because you see them there in Old English. You see related materials in medieval Scandinavian sources. There's a great deal of argument about again, how this works. How does the story get to England? How does the story evolve in Scandinavia? And again, I think there's been a tendency to look at these things as separate. Somehow the story goes to England and lives there for a little while. And then the story must be in origin Scandinavian, and it must then continue all the way through from the dim and distant Iron Age up into the medieval period. And I really wonder that how much interaction there was between Scandinavia and England in the Viking period, in the pre-Viking period, even in the post-Viking period, and how those stories may have been shared, and how really the interaction itself between Scandinavians and English people if affected the evolution of those stories. And looking at it not so much as traditionally scholars like to go back and find the origins and the distant points, and everything evolves in a kind of genetic linear fashion. And I think for this story, and maybe for many others, we need to think more about the connections along the way. That's I think, again, that's part of my interest in connections between cultures and how they interact and influence each other. So I think there's a lot more to be said there that hasn't been said. When people looked at this story and its origins and its evolution, people were looking at it 100 years ago. They were national romanticists. They were very interested in finding the origins of their countries, their cultures. The English were interested in the origins of England. The Scandinavians were interested in the origins of Scandinavia. And that's how they did the research. And I think now, I at least, and maybe other people maybe are less interested in the origins of nations and kingdoms than we are in interactions between people, like we're doing now.
Yeah, and how much we can say that Scandinavian influence in England, or England influences the Scandinavia in terms of language, in terms of culture? How we can say, based on your researchers?
Well, it's long been recognized that the Viking Age had a huge impact on English language and culture. The English language was affected strongly by Scandinavian language to the level of the pronouns, which is very unusual. So when English speakers say they and them, well, those are borrowings from Scandinavia. And you have to have a really profound impact on a language to change pronouns. All of our languages borrow words from other languages, but not usually pronouns. So there is a huge impact on the language. I would say probably a huge impact on the culture, though that's sometimes difficult to access. And that's something we continue to see through the medieval period. So there were still people of Scandinavian descent and aware that they were of Scandinavian descent, and dealing with the legacy of, we are Scandinavians, we came here kind of as conquerors and pagan pirates, but then we also became good Christians. And so there's this very complicated Scandinavian legacy in medieval England and Scotland, of course. And Scottish English probably has more impact, surviving impact from Scandinavian than standard English. But it also goes the other way. When the Scandinavian countries were becoming Christian, English clerics and priests were very influential in the early stages of the establishment of church structures in Scandinavia. The technologies and techniques and the customs of writing in Latin characters on parchment, on vellum, etc. The style of the alphabet, the style of the letters came over. There were a lot of cultural connections. So I think when Scandinavians were starting to learn about wider European history and they were becoming literate in Latin, they were getting materials that came often from England, of course, as well as other parts of the continent. But I think the English church probably had a large influence in the first generations after the conversion. Later, of course, the German church, the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, becomes a more important player probably in Scandinavia. But the English church had a strong impact early on, and I think that brought a lot of wider European learning and learning from the English sphere into Scandinavia. So when the Scandinavians were starting to figure out, okay, now we're Christian and we're in Europe, and what is our place? Where were they going for their information and their resources? I think the English Church provided a lot of that, probably more than people realize. But even the shapes of the letters. Icelandic still has the thorn character and the eth character for the th sounds, which English has in its pronunciation, but no longer uses in its spelling. But those end up in the Scandinavian language from English practice. So in different ways, in different times, there's a lot of connections. Of course, that's not just true of Scandinavia and England, the other Scandinavian, the other surrounding countries in the Baltic, in Scandinavia itself, with the Sami people in the north of Scandinavia, Finnic-speaking people. Obviously also with Ireland, with Eastern Europe and France. There's a lot of interesting connections. I just happen to focus on the North Sea English and Scandinavian connections, probably, but there's obviously a lot more that can be said. And I think people are increasingly talking about that. I think the climate in modern culture and modern scholarship is more friendly to interaction than separation, which people used to be when they were in the 19th century.
Oh, that's a very interesting connection. We saw that monuments are made from Scandinavia to England when they have the incursions, the Viking Age incursions, and that's a lot of connections with these two places and two countries that are some very connections because of these incursions, and it's a lot of interesting to see that the English have a lot of these terms that was originated from the Scandinavian language. And what's the impact from the Germanic age to Scandinavia, to form the Scandinavia?
Yeah, it's obviously, depending on what we're talking about, Indo-European languages arrive in Scandinavia somewhere in the end of the Bronze Age or something like that. I don't know. People argue about when languages come into Scandinavia, Indo-European languages come into Scandinavia. It's probably associated with things like the bell beaker culture and agriculture and so forth and so on. So you have Indo-European languages mixing with non-Indo-European languages in Scandinavia. You have the formation of what we consider the Germanic languages out of these dialects in the last centuries BC. And of course, we tend to say like, oh, there is the Proto-Germanic language and everybody speaks it in southern Scandinavia and in northern Germany and in Frisia and all these things. But there's probably many, many dialects. There's probably a lot of variety, and there's probably a process of languages becoming more like each other. If we look at Scandinavia in the pre-Viking period, again, it looks like people have often talked about common Scandinavian as as if there's like basically one relatively standard language from central Norway and western Norway over down into Denmark, and the runic inscriptions often make it look, I think, a bit like that, because it's really difficult to distinguish dialect differences on the early runic inscriptions. But that's also somewhat, I think, unrealistic. There must have been a lot of variety in Scandinavia, which then was sort of erased as small local dialects probably got pushed aside by prestige dialects moving through elite centers. So if you had, as you probably did, important cultural centers in southern Scandinavia, in Denmark and the islands, people who wanted to associate themselves talked more like that, and so you had this spread of Scandinavian language in the early period. but it's hard to, it's very difficult to talk about Scandinavia and wider Germanic culture because it's so difficult to distinguish the local and the general. This is a problem I have when I teach in classes about Germanic legend and mythology. Obviously, we have legend and sources and classical authors. We have Tacitus and people like that who talk about Germanic tribes in the Roman period. We have some poetry, early poetry from the early medieval period in Germany, and of course, Old English and all sorts of things. But when we talk about mythology, we mostly have medieval Scandinavian sources. Snorri Sturluson, the Poetic Edda, all of which are written down in the 13th century. And we try to use those to talk about Germanic mythology and Germanic religion. And it's very difficult because it's a long way from 13th century Iceland to Bavaria in the Roman period, both in time and space. So, you know, many people have said the term Germanic is a difficult term because we use it because it's convenient and we think we know what it means, but it doesn't always probably mean what we think it means. And when we're talking about Germanic language and Germanic mythology and Germanic culture and Germanic art styles, it becomes very difficult to keep from tricking ourselves into thinking we know more about this past than we do. You know, there's a lot to be said about, say, Scandinavia in the Germanic Iron Age, the centuries right before the Viking Age. But is Scandinavia in that period, when it is the Germanic Iron Age, is it the same as Francia, you know, Alemannia, all these, you know, it's going to be different. So we have to be careful with our terminology. But there is a lot of interesting things to look at in the local context in Scandinavia. And it was probably a much more variable and complicated place than it looks like from our distant position. We look back and we see, oh, it looks like all one runic system, and probably everybody had the same lovely mythology that Snorri Sturluson talked about hundreds of years later. And that's probably not all true. It's probably much more complicated and messy than we like to think it was.
Oh, that's interesting, because when you think in mythology, Germanic mythology and the Norse mythology, we saw that the changes. For example, the god Odin was, and Wotan was transformed, of course, in Odin, and that's one of the points that is more interesting, because we have a lot. We have a lot of how can I say? We have a lot of populations that, example, the Anglo-Saxons and the others, and that is very different because they are not in Scandinavia, but they have the same mythology that originate the Scandinavian Norse mythology.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. Odin, or Woden, is a good example. There's a name that we know is basically the same name. We find him in the continent, we find him in England, we find him in Scandinavia. He obviously goes back for a long time. There's a good chance that, although the Roman author Tacitus does not mention Woden by name, he's probably talking about a god that is an old version of Woden. But at the same time, so we know that this is an old god who ends up in many different parts of the Germanic-speaking world. But our best knowledge about that god, again, comes from 13th century Iceland and what Snorri Sturluson, who's a bit of an Odin fanboy, was thinking. And we try to project that back and look at how this, you know, what did people think about this god? What stories did they have about this god? How did they relate? What was their relationship in terms of ritual with this god? And we don't even have good answers for that for Scandinavia in the in the pre-Christian period. And we have even less good answers about it if we look at continental Germany, if we look at England. We're so dependent on Norse mythology, and especially Snorri Sturluson's attempt to present Norse mythology. And so we look back at Woden and we say, well, what is going on with this god really? How important was he? Was he as important as Snorri wants us to think? Was he something else? Was he different things at different times? And, you know, we're talking about widely scattered pre-literate societies. And we as modern, mostly Western scholars want to create a system and fit everything into the system and say that we have the answer. And that's certainly what Snorri Sturluson was doing in 13th century Iceland. He was saying, this is how it should look. I know because I've heard about classical mythology and Zeus and Jupiter and this is how, you know, we also have, my ancestors also have cool gods and we're just as good. And so I'm going to make it look good. And how was it, you know, really? The whole question, things we think we know, Odin, king of the gods, Valhalla. Was that something that somebody in 5th century England or 3rd century Thuringia would have recognized? I don't know. But that again is what makes it interesting. We think we know sometimes because we think, oh, you know, Odin, king of the gods, Valhalla. I've seen Marvel. And then, you know, is it really like that? Well, probably not. And in some ways that's disappointing because we think we have a beautiful, wonderful system and we think we understand and we think, okay, Woden everywhere. And probably the reality is messier and less consistent. And that might be disappointing if we think we've figured it out and we think we have a system and we think we know. But it's much more interesting actually if we don't know. Because what we don't know is always more fun than what we do know. So for me, this is, you know, it's great. I think, you know, oh, let's talk about the different Odins that we have in different places and different times and how much information do we really have? And that's much more interesting than thinking we know.
Can the Romans be an impact in the Scandinavia's
absolutely
mythology? Yeah.
I don't know so much about mythology, but I think Roman culture has a huge impact on Scandinavia. Again, in the 19th century, people like to think Scandinavia, little bubble outside the Roman boundaries. But of course, there was a huge influence of Rome on Scandinavia. There were Roman goods coming from the empire through northern Germany into Scandinavia. We see in the archaeology huge amounts of prestige goods coming from the Roman Empire into Scandinavia. It's that kind of thing. Oh, the Romans are down there. They have this cool empire. They're super rich. But I'm a chieftain up here in Denmark or southern Sweden, and I want to have that drinking set, those objects from Rome, because that's exotic foreign objects, and that looks awesome. You know, I look good. So I think there's a large amount of material culture that comes into Scandinavia. There's a lot of interest in this powerful, exotic, faraway thing down in Europe, based in the Mediterranean. There are words, there are probably even some words that come in, you know, not just into Germanic, but particularly into Scandinavia in this time. There are people, of course, going from Scandinavia and you know, they're merchants in the Roman world. They travel from Scandinavia into at least the, you know, Germanic-speaking parts of the empire or the Celtic-speaking parts of the empire, maybe all the way down into Italian-speaking parts of the empire. They're interacting with this world. There are people who are serving as, you know, mercenaries. You know, go and make your fortune in the Roman army and come back home to Skåne or Västergötland or wherever you live. And so I think there's a large impact there. There's a knowledge and a fascination with the exotic prestige of the Roman world, which is important in Scandinavia. And you know, the runic system, people argue about the origin of the runes. Is it from Greek? Is it from Latin characters? Is it from Etruscan, North Italic? you know, Celtic speakers using these things. There's a lot of theories, but ultimately this is a influence of a Mediterranean alphabet. You know, it's mediated by the Roman Empire, if not actually delivered by the Roman Empire. And so if you're in Scandinavia, you know that there are, you know, they have a cool writing system. We can have a cool writing system too. So I think there is a strong cultural impact on Scandinavia during the first millennium. And there's this fascination with the Roman world, and also an interest in making, you know, different. Very much, I feel like a lot of what drives Scandinavian culture in that period is we're different from Rome, but we're just as good. And we want to have their cool stuff because that makes us look cool. So yeah, I think a strong impact there. So again, Scandinavia is not some mystic, pristine, ideal Germanic bubble paradise that, you know, people in the 19th century and the earliest 20th century wanted to think that it was. It's absorbing. It's part of that world, even if it's in a dynamic exchange with that world. Of course, it's the third world for the Romans. Those, you know, muddy barbarians up there. So there is very much a center-periphery kind of relationship. And I think that continues through much of the first millennium, because Scandinavia is defining itself in opposition to, but also in concert with the rest of Europe, whether that is the Roman world in the Roman period, whether that is England and Francia in the Merovingian, Carolingian periods, in the Viking Age, and then into the medieval period, still looking to the rest of Europe and say we're like this, we like things about it, but also we're a bit different, and we can't really decide how we fit ourselves. But you do see this process of Scandinavia becoming more and more European, of course, as time goes on. But there's always, even when you get to the 13th century, even when you get to Snorri Sturluson in Iceland, it's, yes, we are, you know, good, proper members of Christian Europe. But we're also just as learned as everybody else. We can do, you know, we can write Latin if we have to, but we're going to mostly write Icelandic. Our pagan ancestors were as good as yours. You have Troy and things, and our gods also came from Troy. Sure, you know. So it's a long process of interaction. That's really what I think about Scandinavian culture through this whole period, as a process of interaction with the people and the cultures around it, and how that gets expressed in Scandinavia. And you see that in all the mythology, all the literature. It doesn't happen without contact. Everybody learns from everybody else.
Yes, it's a very good point. And that's fantastic, because we don't talk about so much about this contact with Scandinavians and the Roman Empire. I think it's a thing that need more research about this topic, because we don't see so much about this. And this is amazing, because we know that Scandinavians go to Roman, and the Romans go to the Scandinavians, and it's a very, very interesting part of the history.
I think this is mostly much of this is the way we have set up academia. We have set up research and study. Again, coming from the 19th century, we have the Germanic department, the Romance department. You know, those are separate. We have history over here. We have literature over here. We have language. We've taken all the things which are part of our lives. All of us, you know, speak at least one language, sometimes two. All of us participate in at least one culture, maybe multiple cultures. All of us have different histories. All of us read different books from different places. All of us listen to different music from different places. But when we study these things, going back to the 19th century, increasingly we specialize and we separate. And you know, if you learn Old English, maybe you don't learn Old Norse, and you don't learn Latin. And if you learn Latin, maybe you learn Greek, but you don't learn Old Norse, or Finnish, or something else. So we have worked very hard to separate all our disciplines, and there is some power in that. There is of course, some power in specialization. You can get very good at one particular thing, but when we get very good at one particular thing, we tend to ignore all the other things. And that's not how humans work. Humans are messy. Humans are doing multiple things at once. Humans are going to different places and interacting. If we tried to pull one person out of the 13th century, or the 11th century, or the 5th century, or the 2nd century, or 500 BC, sure, we could easily find some people who never went very far from where they are born. But we would find other people who are breaking through all of our academic disciplines. They live in the literature world, they live in the language world, they live in the history world, they live in the economic world, they have archaeology, archaeological remains, they speak this language, they speak another language. If you're a merchant in the Roman world, or in the Merovingian world, or you're a churchman who's traveling from Rome to England, or God help you, Scandinavia, how many different cultures are you going to pass through? How many different places are you going to see? You're going to be bringing materials and ideas with you. You're going to be picking up new ideas and materials there. We live in an intercultural world today, and many people did 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. And our system of study is not very well set up for that. Even today in Scandinavian studies, archaeologists don't always talk to the linguists, and the linguists don't always talk to the historians, and etc. So we compartmentalize ourselves, we shut ourselves off a little bit. It's difficult to learn everything there is to know now, but I think that's one of the reasons that we need more collaboration between scholars. And we need more scholars from different places. There's excellent work now in Scandinavian studies being done in Brazil, in Asia, and other places. And that also brings different perspectives. You think about the literature and the archaeology differently if you're from Japan, or if you're from South America, or if you're from somewhere else that is not Scandinavia, or not the English-speaking world, or not North America. So that helps us, I think, a little bit. There's some proof that even if we can't individually learn everything, we can work together and bring new ideas together that way, and bridge some of these gaps and chasms we have put between our different areas of study. So here we are. I'm from the States, and I'm living in Colombia, and you're in Brazil, and here we are talking about Scandinavian, the Roman Empire. So we have the technology.
Yes, it's amazing, because in that time we have these possibilities, and imagining how Scandinavians see the Roman Empire, or the Roman Empire see the populations of Scandinavia. It's a very interesting thing, because so much of the Romans think they are barbarian, but they some exchanges, some things relationship with the market, and made this exchange. We have some examples, some archaeological things in the Scandinavian relationship with the Roman Empire.
Absolutely. There's many objects from the Roman world that end up in early Scandinavia during the first half millennium AD, during the Roman period. Obviously, some of those objects remained in circulation even after Rome falls, but once you always have this ongoing relationship between Scandinavia and the rest of Europe. If that's the Roman world, then you see those connections. When you see, the new power in Europe becomes the Merovingians and the Carolingians in Francia, you also see those relationships with, between Scandinavian there, and you see the complicated cultural and political relationships between, especially southern Scandinavia, Denmark, and the people just south of them, especially the Franks, and then the English also. So absolutely, there's no question that you have lots of contact between these peoples, and we can see that in the archaeology. And of course, we can't see it always as easily in the language or the stories, but people talk and people exchange ideas. So I think there's probably a lot that obviously we can't see it, we can't recover it, we don't know for sure, but we would be foolish to think that people were not exchanging ideas and stories. And there are sometimes, I think, again, if we go and look at the material of Beowulf and the Scandinavian material, there are obvious relationships there, but what nobody can decide on is what those relationships are, because it's complicated. And we like to think, okay, we're going to, go back to some finite point of origins, but really what we have is interactions going on over probably centuries in different contexts, written contexts, literate people in in England talking to illiterate or semi-literate people from Scandinavia, ideas going back and forth different ways at different times. So all through the period, I think we can look at, influence from Roman culture, from Frankish and English culture, and of course all the other things that you see in Scandinavia too. I'm not even talking about, we're focused on Rome and Francia and England, but of course there is ongoing contact with Eastern Europe, with the Baltic countries, with the Finnic speaking world, as well as say the Celtic speaking world in Ireland probably has a certain amount of impact in the North Atlantic as well. So everywhere people are getting in touch with each other, something is going on.
Yeah, it's a very, very amazing part of the history. I don't have the idea that have a lot of history between this contact with these two different places that have different cultures, different forms of doing political, economic things. And that's very interesting to see this contact with the Roman Empire and the Scandinavian part. And I have a curiosity about how Colombia study about Viking Age. How this study?
Not so much. I grew up in the United States. I studied in England. I ended up in Colombia because my wife is Colombian, and so we moved to Colombia. And there's not a lot of Viking Age studies in Colombia, although in the town that I live in, which is Chía, just outside the capital Bogota, there is another guy I know who did his master's degree in Reykjavik and Oslo, and he has an MA in Scandinavian studies. And so we keep saying that along with your Neve group in Brazil, we must be the second, the two of us must be the second largest Viking studies group in South America. I don't know if that's true, but we must be one of the larger ones. I'm here, largely by accident, and I teach mostly. I mostly train English teachers and teach in education and social sciences at my university here, the Universidad de la Sabana. But I also teach for an online university in the States, Signum University, which has been going probably for 10 years or so, and probably in 2016 or 2017. I was asked if I would develop a course on Old Norse for them, and I hadn't taught Old Norse previously, and I hadn't worked on Old Norse as much then because I'm mostly working for education here in Colombia. But I said, of course, I can do an Old Norse course, and so we started. I started teaching Old Norse with them, and we teach courses every few years, and we must be one of the larger Old Norse programs in the world. I think we just finished a 12-week master's level introduction to Old Norse course that had more than 25 people in it, and we're starting a a second course on reading Eddic poetry in Old Norse next week. And I think there's still almost 20 people in the course. So that's a lot of people taking Old Norse. When I was in university, my Old Norse class had like 4 people in it. So it's a big group. So it's nice to see the interest. And I also teach some other short courses in Old Norse for Signum University, some adult continuing education courses. And I have right now a group of probably almost 10 students in the adult continuing education course, and then we just have like 25 people in the introduction to Old Norse, and probably almost 20 in the part 2 Eddic poetry course. So that's been a lot of what I've done for the past several years, is teaching Old Norse online. We also teach Old Norse literature in English translation. I'm afraid I don't know if there are many Portuguese translations of Old Norse literature, but or editions that are available in Portuguese. I do have a nice book in Spanish about, it's an Old Norse grammar, Islandés Antiguo or something like that. But I don't know how the materials are in Portuguese. But obviously there's a big group down in Brazil, Johnny Langer and all the people in Neve.
Yeah.
So I think, you know, since I am an adopted South American, all of us South Americans need to stick together and promote Viking studies in South America. So if you and the other people in Brazil want to collaborate on something, let me know. I'm not very good at Portuguese, but I'll try.
We have a lot of students that have interest in Brazil, in Norse mythology, Viking Age, and I saw that Colombia have interest in too, because I saw that it's not. I don't know if Brazil have a lot interesting, or Colombia have much more, but sometimes people say.
I think Brazil is the big one. I mean, Brazil is the big country, the big economy. So I think you guys are probably the big players in South America. In Colombia, I think it's myself and this other guy. And it was him and me here in Chile. We were talking about doing a paper on the rock stone, but we haven't really got around to it. But and we talk about saying we should open the Colombian Institute for Old Norse Studies. That would be the two of us here in Chile. But I think it's you know, it was always perceived, and I think to some extent still, the Scandinavian countries, of course, see themselves as the, you know, the preeminent scholars of the Viking Age and Old Norse studies. But I think this is the 21st century. It's something that, you know, the materials can be accessed and produced for everyone. And I think the having all these different international viewpoints on a topic. I mean, there's nothing that makes the 21st century Norwegian particularly closer to a 10th century Norwegian than anybody else. It's a very different culture. It's a very different time. So it's good to have all these different perspectives, you know, the perspectives from modern Scandinavians, the perspectives from modern Europeans, but also perspectives of people from Asia, from South America. You know, we get more ideas when we have more diversity in people's backgrounds and thinking, and we'll get a better sense of what was really going on. And we'll have a better sense of this. Because why do we study these things? Because these people are different from us. They're not the same as us. And just like if we travel and we go to another country and we see other people doing things another way, we think like, oh, that tells us something about us. We're learning about ourselves by learning about people who are different. And that's, you know, also true when we're looking at the past. When I look at somebody in, you know, 13th century Iceland or 10th century Sweden, they're not me. No matter how much some people might like to think that they are. They're not me. I'm learning something about somebody different. And my perspective as a 21st century person is one thing, and your perspective will be different than mine, and somebody else's perspective will be different from both of ours. And we need those different ideas to give us the full picture. We need all these different views from different angles. So I hope that Old Norse Studies has a bright future in Colombia and in Brazil and in other places in the world. And it, it moves a little bit beyond the kind of identity idea. Yes, in the 19th century, Europeans and Scandinavians were very interested in the past of their nations and their kingdoms, and they were looking for their origins. And of course, like I said at the beginning of our talk, my family has Scandinavian heritage, and my aunt gave me a book about Norse mythology, and I thought, oh, this is cool. But it's not just about, it doesn't matter that I have Scandinavian heritage, or other people are looking for the origins of their kingdoms. Now we're not looking for the origins of nations and kingdoms so much. That's not why we're here to learn about these people. We're here to learn about these people because they're other people like us, and they did things differently. And we want to learn something about ourselves by looking at them, and that we can do that whether we are Norwegian, or whether we're Brazilian, or whether we're American, or whether we're Japanese, or so. Yeah, I don't know if there's a big amount of Viking studies in Colombia. That's mostly me and my other friend here. But maybe some more in the future.
That's interesting because some people say to me, "Oh, Colombia have some persons that are interested in."
That might be me. Maybe there's a few others. If you're in Colombia and you're doing Viking studies, you're seeing Moshe's interview, then please let me know. Here I am. You can find me online.
That's nice. And Professor, how books you indicate for you have some tips for saying to the audience of the channel, how books you say that, oh, that's good to learn in Spanish? Or
well, I do have, there is a grammar for Old Norse in Spanish. I don't know if there's one in Brazilian, in Portuguese. And I have had some other students. I have had students from Japan and from Italy and from Turkey. And, it's kind of sad to say, but I think one of the most important things you can do to study Old Norse and medieval Scandinavia is to know English, because so much is written and published in English. And even if you can't speak English or understand English very easily, being able to read it is going to be helpful. Of course, if you can't read it, then Google Translate is going to be your friend. So there are many possibilities. But for Old Norse studies, depending on your interest, I think for most of us outside of Scandinavia, if you're inside of Scandinavia, then archaeology is great. But if we are outside of Scandinavia, then it's difficult to do much archaeology. Luckily, most of the Scandinavian archaeologists put up their materials online for free, academia.edu, ResearchGate, and you can get a lot of materials. A lot of it is written in English by the Scandinavians because they're looking for that wider audience. So again, that's helpful. If you're interested in the language, there are excellent materials now available in English, at least, for learning Old Norse. There's a lot of variety. You can access things for free. If you see Jackson Crawford's videos online on YouTube, I know you've interviewed with him too. Those are excellent resources. The materials from the Viking Society, the Viking Society's webpage, if you search for the Viking Society's network publications, or however they call it, they have a lot of materials for free, including materials for learning Old Norse, all in English, of course, but Jesse Byock's books for learning Old Norse are also good and useful. I know Jackson Crawford is working on materials for teaching Old Norse. I have materials for teaching Old Norse that I use with my students, not yet published or anything, but there's a lot of material. So there's a lot of opportunities for learning the language. And if, English is probably necessary for that, but it's easy to get materials in English nowadays. and you can see Iceland puts a lot of the manuscript images online, so you can go look at images of the manuscripts and really get to grips with them. That's stuff that was impossible when I was in university, 30 years ago. There was no internet, there was no high resolution manuscript images. It was hard to find books to learn the language. They were expensive. But now there's a lot of materials online. There's a lot of good editions and translations certainly in English. A lot of materials that were good editions that were published 100 years ago are still good editions, and you can find them on archive.org in PDF form. So there are a lot of materials. A lot of it is helpful to read English, and then of course German or this modern Scandinavian languages. But because there are so many materials available, I'm hoping to see more of these things made available. I know that there's a edition of Voluspa there's a translation of Voluspa in Spanish. I don't know if there's like a whole poetic edit, but maybe there is, and maybe it's just out of print and I haven't seen it. I don't know about Portuguese. I don't know how many translations are available in Portuguese, how much teaching material there is in Portuguese. I know that when I asked my Italian student about are there editions of the sagas or translations, and she was like, I don't really know, I read them in English. Sorry. But I think that would be, that's something important that makes it accessible and easy. I got into this because my aunt gave me a book about Norse mythology, written in English in a way that a 12-year-old could understand. So it's great that now it's easy to learn Old Norse online, but that's not going to help the 12-year-old who doesn't have money for courses and things. But if somebody makes, a book available in Portuguese or in Spanish or whatever language, then there's a way into the materials for kids and interested adults and teenagers, and that's so important. So again, if there are people out there in Brazil or other parts of South America who want to work on these things and have an interest, my Portuguese is non-existent, my Spanish is not great, but we can figure it out. I'm happy to. I think it'd be great to work with more people and produce more of these kinds of materials. But if you just go online and you find recent publications from Scandinavian scholars on academia.eu, on ResearchGate, you find the old editions by people like Finnur Jonsson and all that from the early Sophus Bugge, and lots of people made great editions early in the 20th century. Those are now out of copyright. You can get the PDFs for free. Jackson Crawford's YouTube channel is great. I send all my students there. People sometimes tell me, you should have a YouTube channel, Carl. I'm like, no, Jackson Crawford has that taken care of. YouTube doesn't need me.
Yes, I interviewed him, and he is very, a very intelligent person. He knows a lot about the Norse, and he is dedicated with that, and have a lot of great books of him. I think he has 3 books publicated about. I think he was 2 sagas.
He has a Volsunga saga, Ragnar saga. Yeah, I use some of those when I teach sagas in translation. I use Caroline Larrington's Poetic Edda translation also. There are so many good scholars in the field now, depending on what your interest is. More literature, more language, more archaeology. It's difficult to suggest particular books, especially because so many of the publications are in English, even if they're coming out of Scandinavia. So again, I think I feel bad saying it as a native English speaker, but I think if you were going to do one thing to learn about medieval Scandinavia, probably learning English is a really important thing, at least to be able to read English right now, or to use Google Translate really well, because so much of that material is available. And again, I think that's why even though we have tools like Google Translate now, and if somebody has published an article in a language I don't read, I can put it into Google Translate and read it. Again, making materials available to the public. There's so much fake news about Scandinavia, so and Vikings and things like that, and so many crazy ideas that people get. And a lot of this is because the material just isn't available. And especially if you don't read English and there's not a lot available in your language, whether that's Portuguese or Italian or Japanese or whatever language is your first language. So I'm really hoping to see more of that work, to make things accessible, easily accessible. Yes, of course, people who have been working in the field for 30 years can read like 3 different languages and stuff like that. But the 12-year-old kid cannot. So it would be great to see more of that. I would be nervous myself to translate anything into Spanish because my Spanish isn't good enough.
Yeah.
But I would be happy. I would love to work with people and make materials available in Spanish or in Portuguese. That would be great.
Oh, it's very, very great if we have much more translations. Brazil made some translations, but
yeah, I've seen some.
More, yeah, and if you have much more, you'll be more accessible to people that want to learn about the Viking Age. So, Professor, thank you so much for doing this interview, for the channel, for the persons in Brazil that like your work. And
thank you.
It's very great to receive you. And do you have something that you want to talk much more, or
I've probably talked enough. Just that, no, what I'd really like to do is thank you, not just for inviting me, but for having this channel and to do this work that makes material more accessible and inspires people. I think that's really important in this day and age. So it's my honor to be here to talk with somebody who is as knowledgeable and enthusiastic as you are. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I will just stop the recording and we can talk more.